My sibling dumped her kids on my porch at 4 a.m. Her short note left me frozen. When I confronted her, she screamed, "You're just trying to steal my kids for money." She used her kids for donation money? Then karma hit. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Natalie Harper. I'm 35 years old. And if you'd asked me that morning what the biggest problem in my life was, I probably would have complained about another overnight shift. I had no idea that by sunrise, I'd be responsible for 2 small children. I worked nights at a regional medical laboratory, so getting home after dawn was normal. My routine rarely changed. Drive home, feed my cat, shower, sleep. It wasn't exciting, but it was predictable. That morning, I pulled into my driveway just after 6. At first, I thought someone had left luggage near my front steps. Then I noticed 2 little figures sitting beside it. I slammed the car into park. "Sophie?" The little girl looked up and gave me a tiny smile that didn't belong on a 5-year-old. "Aunt Natalie." She sounded relieved, but not surprised. Next to her sat Mason, only 3 years old, hugging a worn stuffed dinosaur. "What? What are you two doing here?" Instead of answering, Sophie picked up a white envelope resting on one of the suitcases. "This is for you." My stomach tightened before I opened it. Inside was one short note. "Natalie, please take care of them until things get better. I'll come back when I can. Vanessa." That was it. No explanation, no address, no phone number, nothing. I read it 3 times. Then I looked down the street expecting to see Vanessa's SUV. Nothing. I crouched in front of the kids. "When did Mommy leave?" "It was still dark," Sophie said quietly. "Did she tell you where she was going?" She shook her head. "She just said to wait here." I looked at Mason. "Buddy, are you okay?" He nodded automatically, like saying yes was simply expected. That bothered me more than if he'd cried. Most kids his age would have been scared. These 2 just waited. Only then did I really notice the suitcases. They were neatly packed with jackets, a blanket, lunch bags, and favorite belongings. This didn't look like an emergency. It looked planned. Maybe Vanessa had an accident after dropping them off. Maybe something terrible had happened. "Aunt Natalie?" Sophie's voice pulled me back. "Are we in trouble?" My heart sank. "No." I forced a smile. "Absolutely not." She studied my face for a second before quietly nodding. I brought them inside. Within minutes, my quiet house felt completely different. Tiny shoes sat by the front door. Mason settled on the living room rug without touching anything. He didn't ask for cartoons. He didn't make a mess. He simply waited. Sophie stayed close beside me. "Can I help?" "You don't have to. I can unpack." "You don't have to do that either." She hesitated. "I'll just wait then." Kids weren't supposed to ask permission just to exist. "I'll make breakfast," I said. "What do you want?" "Whatever's easiest." Not pancakes, not cereal. Just whatever wouldn't make my life harder. I made scrambled eggs and toast with what I had. While Mason ate, Sophie quietly slid pieces of her toast onto his plate before taking another bite herself. She thought I didn't notice. I pretended not to. After breakfast, I stepped into the hallway and called Vanessa. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. By the 5th call, I knew she wasn't answering. I left one message. "Vanessa, it's me. I have the kids. Call me back. Please." Nothing. I texted. "Where are you?" No response. "Are you okay?" Nothing. "The kids are asking about you." Still nothing. I looked back into the living room. Sophie was quietly reading one of Mason's picture books aloud. Neither of them asked when their mom was coming back. That silence bothered me more than anything. I opened my contacts. There was one person who might know what was really going on. I stared at Ethan's name for a few seconds, then pressed call. Ethan picked up before the second ring. "Hey, Natalie." His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Ethan, it's Vanessa." There was a short pause. "What happened?" "She left Sophie and Mason on my porch this morning." Another pause. "I found a note." He didn't interrupt. "It just says to take care of them until things get better. She won't answer her phone." I expected him to ask if I was serious. Instead, he quietly exhaled. "So, she finally did it." I frowned. "What do you mean, finally?" "I'll explain," he said. "But first, are the kids okay?" "They're safe." "And Vanessa?" "I have no idea where she is." He stayed silent for a moment before speaking again. "Don't unpack anything yet." I blinked. "What?" "Just leave the suitcases exactly the way they are." "Why?" "I'll tell you when I get there." "You know something, don't you?" "I know enough to be worried." The call ended a minute later, leaving me with far more questions than answers. I walked back into the living room. Mason had fallen asleep on the couch with his dinosaur tucked under one arm. Sophie looked up from her picture book. "Was that Mommy?" "No." She nodded once, then looked back down without asking another question. That shouldn't have surprised me anymore. I sat beside her. "Sweetheart, can I ask you something?" She closed the book. "Okay." "When was the last time you were here?" She thought for a second. "A long time." "Did your mom tell you how long you'd stay with me?" She shook her head. "Just until she comes back." "And when will that be?" "I don't know." She answered every question politely but carefully. Never too much. Never too little. Almost like she had learned exactly how much she was allowed to say. I changed the subject. "Would you like to watch a movie while we wait?" Her eyes lit up for the first time all morning. "Can Mason pick?" "Of course." When he woke up a few minutes later, he chose an old animated dinosaur movie. The two of them sat shoulder to shoulder under the same blanket. For a little while, they looked like ordinary kids. I used that quiet moment to text my supervisor. "Family emergency. I won't be able to come in tonight." The reply came almost immediately. "Take care of your family. We'll figure out coverage." That single message almost made me cry, not because of work, because someone had called these kids my family without even thinking about it. Around lunchtime, I made grilled cheese sandwiches. Sophie waited until I sat down before taking a bite. "You don't have to wait for me," I said. She looked confused. "Mom says it's rude." "It's okay." She smiled politely. Then she still waited. Little things kept standing out. Every time Mason dropped something, he apologized. Every time I opened the refrigerator, Sophie asked if it was okay for her to have water. Water. Not juice. Not cookies. Water. I couldn't stop wondering what life had been like before they showed up at my house. A little after 1 o'clock, my phone rang again. "Ethan." "I'm about 30 minutes away." "You're actually coming?" "Yeah." "I wasn't sure you would." "They're important to me too." His answer came so naturally that I didn't know how to respond. The breakup between him and Vanessa had been messy. We hadn't spoken much since then. Honestly, I'd assumed both of them wanted nothing to do with each other anymore. Apparently, I had been wrong. Before hanging up, I asked the question that had been bothering me since our first call. "Ethan, why did you say she finally did it?" The line went quiet. When he answered, his voice sounded tired. "Because I've been afraid of this for months." "What are you talking about?" "I'll explain everything." Another pause. "But Natalie." "Yeah? Please promise me one thing." "What?" "Don't open those suitcases." I looked toward the hallway where they were still sitting exactly where I'd left them. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." His tone turned serious. Leave everything exactly the way it is until I get there. Then he hung up. I stood there staring at the luggage. Just 2 ordinary suitcases. A few hours earlier, I thought they only held clothes for a short visit. Now I wasn't so sure. And for the first time that morning, I wasn't certain they had been packed for a visit at all. The doorbell rang right as Mason finished his movie. I opened the door and found Ethan standing there with 2 paper bags from a grocery store. "I figured you probably didn't have enough food for 2 extra kids," he said. That was the first thing he said. Not, "How are you?" Not, "Can I come in?" Just a practical solution. "Thanks," I said, stepping aside. He walked in, and Sophie looked up from the couch. "Hi, Ethan." "Hey, Soph." His smile was warm but careful. Mason ran over and hugged his leg without saying a word. Ethan knelt down and hugged him back. "I missed you too, buddy." I watched the whole exchange in silence. This wasn't someone who barely knew the kids. He knew exactly how to talk to them. Once the children were busy coloring at the kitchen table, Ethan looked toward the hallway. "The suitcases?" "I didn't touch them." "Good." We carried them into the living room and unzipped the first one together. I expected clothes. There were clothes. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Everything was organized into labeled folders and zippered pouches. Birth certificates, vaccination records, medical insurance cards, prescription medicine, extra eyeglasses for Sophie, even copies of emergency contacts. I looked at Ethan. "Who packs like this for a few days?" He didn't answer right away. We opened the second suitcase. More clothes, favorite stuffed animals, children's books, school worksheets, a small envelope with $400 in cash. Every item had its place. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked forgotten. I slowly sat back. "This isn't a weekend bag." Ethan quietly nodded. "No. It looks like..." He finished my sentence. "Someone preparing for someone else to raise her kids." The words hit harder once they were spoken out loud. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Instead, I picked up one of Sophie's school folders. Inside were recent progress reports, even her teacher's contact information. Vanessa hadn't forgotten anything important. She had remembered everything. That somehow made it worse. I looked at Ethan again. "What happened to her?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "You know she always wanted attention online. I know she liked posting. It stopped being just posting." He leaned back in his chair. "About a year ago, she became obsessed with growing her audience." "How obsessed?" "Every decision started revolving around content." He gave a tired laugh that wasn't really a laugh. Restaurants weren't restaurants anymore. They were filming locations. Family dinners became live streams. Vacations became photo shoots. I stayed quiet. The kids slowly disappeared from her pages. I frowned. Disappeared? At first they showed up less often. Then she stopped mentioning them completely. Why? Because brands were more interested in the image she was creating. What image? A young, independent lifestyle creator who could travel anytime. I stared at him. "So she pretended she didn't have children?" He nodded once. "Not to everyone. But to enough people." Pieces that had never fit together suddenly started making more sense. I'd noticed she posted less about birthdays, less about school, less about family. I'd assumed she simply wanted more privacy. Apparently, that wasn't it. "She talked about moving to Miami for months," Ethan continued. "Networking events, brand deals, influencer programs. I thought it was just another dream." So did I. He looked toward the kids before lowering his voice. "But then she started leaving them with neighbors. Sometimes with babysitters she barely knew. And sometimes..." He stopped. "And sometimes what?" "They were alone longer than they should have been." The room felt very quiet. I glanced toward Sophie. She was helping Mason choose the right crayon like nothing in the world was wrong. I couldn't imagine anyone willingly walking away from them. Ethan reached into his backpack. I didn't want to show you this over the phone. He held a folder in his hand but didn't open it. I kept screenshots. Of what? Conversations with Vanessa. I looked at him. There are things she told me. He paused for a second. That I don't think she ever wanted you to see. Ethan unlocked his phone and slid it across the coffee table. I never thought I'd be showing these to anyone. The first few messages didn't seem unusual. Vanessa complained about being tired, about balancing work, about feeling stuck. I almost felt sorry for her. Then the tone started changing. I can't keep dragging the kids everywhere. No one wants to watch family content anymore. Every opportunity disappears the second people find out I'm a mom. I looked up. She actually said that? Ethan nodded. Keep reading. A few weeks later, the messages became colder. Natalie has a stable job. She likes kids. She'd never turn them away. I swallowed hard. So she was talking about me. For months. I kept scrolling. Some messages had no replies because Ethan simply stopped arguing. Others ended with him begging her to slow down and think about the kids first. What happened between you two? I asked quietly. I finally told her I couldn't support the way she was living anymore. And? She said I was holding her back. He shrugged without looking at me. That was basically the end. Neither of us spoke for a minute. The sound of crayons scraping across paper filled the silence. When I looked over, Sophie was helping Mason color outside the lines without correcting him. She smiled every time he laughed. It was such a normal little moment that it made everything else feel even harder to understand. I got up to grab a box of crackers from the pantry. The kids both thanked me before taking one. A few minutes later, I noticed Sophie glance toward me. She thought I wasn't paying attention. She quietly slipped 2 crackers into her sweater pocket. Not for herself. When Mason finished his snack, she pulled them back out and handed them to him. Here. You can have mine. He accepted them without question, like they'd done this before. I sat down beside her. Sophie. She froze. I'm not upset. Her shoulders relaxed a little. You don't have to save food here. She looked embarrassed. I just wanted to make sure Mason had enough. There's plenty. You promise? I promise. She nodded. But she still held the empty wrapper in both hands for another minute before finally throwing it away. Ethan had noticed too. Neither of us said anything until the kids wandered into the living room to play. Finally he spoke. She used to do that at my apartment. Sophie? Yeah. I'd buy pizza and she'd hide slices for Mason. I thought she was just being a protective big sister. His voice became quieter. Now I'm not so sure. Not long after that, Mason accidentally dropped one of his toy dinosaurs. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud clack. Ethan instinctively said, "Whoa, buddy." Nothing harsh. Not even close. But Mason immediately covered his head with both arms. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He kept repeating it. Ethan knelt beside him. Hey. No one's mad. It's okay. Mason peeked up slowly. You sure? I'm sure. It took almost a full minute before he relaxed again. I felt my chest tighten. 3-year-olds weren't supposed to react like that to an ordinary voice. The afternoon drifted by in small moments. Sophie eventually asked if she could help fold clean towels. Mason followed me from room to room carrying his dinosaur. Neither child wandered far from where I was. It wasn't clingy. It felt more like they needed to know exactly where the safe adult was. As the sun started going down, Ethan gathered his things. I should head out. I walked him to the door. What are you going to do? He asked. I don't know yet. You can't force Vanessa to answer. I know. But you also can't pretend this is normal. I looked back toward the living room. Sophie was reading to Mason again. Their voices were soft, comfortable. For the first time all day, they almost looked relaxed. I folded my arms. I kept telling myself she'd call. Ethan waited. I kept thinking there had to be some explanation. And now? I slowly shook my head. I'm done waiting for one. There was a long pause before Ethan quietly nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the image of Sophie and Mason sitting quietly on my front porch, like they already knew no one was coming back for them. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Waiting for Vanessa to call wasn't a plan anymore. I needed to report what had happened. Making that phone call was harder than I expected. Part of me still felt like I was betraying my own sister. The woman on the other end listened without interrupting while I explained everything, from the note to the unanswered phone calls. She asked careful questions. When was the last confirmed contact with their mother? The note was the only thing she left. Do you believe the children are safe in your care today? Yes. Do you know where their mother is? No. There was a short pause before she said, "We'll send someone out today." I thanked her, hung up, and just sat there staring at my phone. This was real now. A little before noon, there was a knock at my door. The social worker introduced herself as Diane. She wasn't cold or intimidating like I'd imagined. She smiled at the kids first. "Hi, Sophie. Hi, Mason. My name's Diane." Mason hid behind my leg. Sophie gave a quiet, "Hello?" Diane didn't push. She simply crouched to their level and started talking about the stuffed dinosaur in Mason's hands. Within a few minutes, he answered one of her questions with a tiny nod. Watching her work made me realize she'd done this many times before. She spent nearly an hour in my house. She photographed the suitcases. She copied Vanessa's handwritten note. She looked through the documents we'd found inside. Then she asked if she could speak with me privately. We sat at the kitchen table. "You did the right thing by contacting us," she said. "I wasn't sure it would feel that way." It rarely does. Her honesty caught me off guard. She asked about Vanessa, our family, and whether anything like this had ever happened before. I answered everything as accurately as I could. If I didn't know something, I said I didn't know. I wasn't trying to make Vanessa look worse. The facts already sounded bad enough. Before Diane left, she asked one more question. "Do any of your neighbors have security cameras facing your house?" I blinked. I think Mr. Lawson across the street does." Within the hour, Diane spoke with him. He didn't hesitate to help. We all stood in his living room while he pulled up the footage from that morning. The timestamp read 4:07 a.m. Vanessa's SUV slowly pulled into my driveway. She got out, opened the back door, helped Mason onto the sidewalk, handed Sophie one of the suitcases. Then she carried the second one to my porch. She placed the envelope on top, knocked once, not very hard. She looked toward the front door for maybe 2 seconds. Then she turned around, got back into her SUV, and drove away. She never looked back. Nobody in the room said anything. The video spoke for itself. Diane quietly asked Mr. Lawson if she could save a copy. He nodded. "Of course." Back at my house, Diane explained the next steps. "Based on what we've documented today, we're requesting temporary placement while we continue the investigation." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means Sophie and Mason can remain here with you." "For now?" "For now." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The relief lasted only a second before reality settled in. Temporary placement wasn't the same as knowing what would happen tomorrow. It simply meant the kids had somewhere safe tonight. Before leaving, Diane handed me a folder with emergency contacts and appointment information. "The children will need medical evaluations as soon as possible." "Okay. We've already arranged them." Once the front door closed, the house felt unusually quiet. Sophie walked over. "Is that lady mad at Mommy?" I knelt beside her. "No." "Then why was she asking so many questions?" Because she wants to make sure you're safe. Sophie thought about that for a second. Then she nodded. I like her. That small answer somehow made me smile. The appointments were scheduled for the following morning. I assumed they would be routine. Just paperwork. Basic checkups. Nothing more. I couldn't have been more wrong. Before the afternoon was over, Diane called me one last time. There are a few things the doctor wants to discuss after the examinations, she said carefully. They noticed some older injuries that don't appear to have been treated. I tightened my grip on the phone. What kind of injuries? I'm afraid that's a conversation we'll need to have in person. The doctor met with me after the examinations while Sophie and Mason colored in the waiting area. She spoke carefully. The injuries aren't life-threatening. I let out a breath. But, she glanced down at the report. We found bruises in different stages of healing and a wrist injury that appears to have healed on its own without treatment. I stared at her. So this didn't happen recently? She slowly shook her head. Not based on what we're seeing. I thanked her, even though I barely remembered walking out of the office. The kids climbed into my car, chatting about the stickers the nurse had given them, completely unaware of the conversation I'd just had. That almost broke my heart more than the report itself. Life didn't stop because everything had changed. Bills still needed to be paid. Groceries still needed to be bought. I couldn't simply stay home forever. I called my manager and explained the situation. To my surprise, she offered to move me to temporary day shifts. It won't be permanent, she said, but it should help until things settle down. I thanked her more times than she probably wanted to hear. It wasn't perfect. I'd be making less money, but at least I could be home with the kids at night. The first evening on our new routine was awkward in a strangely comforting way. Mason insisted on carrying his own pajamas to the bathroom. Sophie asked if she should wash the dinner plates. You're 5, I said with a laugh. You don't have to do dishes. She looked genuinely surprised. So, what should I do? Go be a kid, she smiled. I'm still practicing. That answer stayed with me. Bedtime turned out to be another surprise. As soon as I switched off Mason's bedroom light, he sat straight up. No. His voice wasn't loud, it was scared. I turned the light back on. Too dark? He nodded quickly. Can the hallway light stay on? Of course. He didn't fall asleep until he could see a strip of light coming through the cracked bedroom door. Sophie was easier. Before climbing into bed, she quietly asked, Can I have some water? You never have to ask. She hesitated. Even at night? Even at night. Every small rule they expected made me wonder what rules existed in their old home. A few days passed. The house slowly found its own rhythm. Breakfast together. School worksheets at the kitchen table. Short trips to the park. Mason finally laughed loudly enough that it startled even him. Sophie started correcting me whenever I lost at simple card games. Little by little, they stopped acting like guests. One afternoon, my phone rang. The caller introduced herself as Linda. She'd lived in Vanessa's apartment building until recently. I heard about the children, she said. I've been wondering whether I should call. I thanked her for reaching out. She hesitated before continuing. There were nights when the kids knocked on my door. My grip tightened around the phone. They'd say their mom was downstairs filming or live streaming. How old were they? The same age as they are now. A day later, another call came from a former babysitter named Rachel. She sounded nervous. I don't want to cause problems. You won't. I just think someone should know. She told me Vanessa sometimes extended 2-hour babysitting jobs into entire evenings without answering her phone. Payments arrived late. Sometimes, not at all. The kids were sweet, Rachel said quietly. They always seemed worried about making anyone upset. The stories were different, but they all pointed in the same direction. None of these people knew each other. Yet they described the same patterns, the same excuses, the same children. That evening, Ethan stopped by with takeout. I told him about the phone calls. He wasn't surprised. I figured people would eventually start talking. I wish they had sooner. So do I. While we cleaned up dinner, I remembered the old tablet we'd found inside one of the suitcases. I never even checked if this thing works. I plugged it into a charger on the kitchen counter. The screen stayed black for a minute. Then it suddenly lit up. No password. Just a familiar wallpaper. A few seconds later, notification after notification began appearing across the screen. Emails, messages, calendar reminders, cloud backups. Everything was still connected, including Vanessa's accounts. Ethan and I looked at each other as notifications kept filling the screen. Neither of us touched the tablet for a few seconds. Finally, I picked it up. This can't still be logged in. It looks like she forgot to disconnect it, Ethan said. The home screen opened without asking for a password. There were dozens of calendar reminders, content shoots, brand meetings, flights, hotel reservations. Almost everything was scheduled weeks in advance. I opened the Notes app. At first, it looked like nothing more than brainstorming ideas, video titles, caption drafts, partnership goals. Then I found a folder labeled Miami Plans. Inside was a checklist: find apartment, meet agency, update branding, remove old family content. I frowned. Remove family content? Ethan sighed. I told you. I kept scrolling. There were pages of ideas about building a new online image. One sentence stopped me cold. People connect better when they think you're completely available. Another note was even worse. Natalie will help if I need space. Family never says no. I read it twice, then a third time. She hadn't hoped I would take the kids. She had expected it. Ethan quietly shook his head. She planned around you. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Everything I'd been trying to explain away suddenly felt impossible to ignore. The suitcase, the documents, the cash, the notes. They all pointed in the same direction. Before I could open another file, my phone started ringing. Vanessa. For a second, I just stared at her name. Then I answered. Where are you? She ignored the question. I need you to do something. No hello. No asking about Sophie or Mason. Nothing. What do you need? I emailed you temporary guardianship papers. I frowned. What? Just sign them. So you know exactly where your kids are. I always knew where they were. I felt my jaw tighten. You disappeared. I've been busy. Busy? I told you I'd come back. You left 2 children on my porch before sunrise. She let out an impatient sigh. Can we not do this right now? I looked over at Sophie, who was helping Mason stack building blocks on the living room floor. They've been asking questions. They're fine. You don't even know that. I know they're with you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You haven't asked about them once. They're safe, aren't they? That's not the point. Her voice sharpened. Just sign the paperwork. I'm not signing anything. You don't even know what it says. I know enough. If you want me to help you, then tell me where you are. Silence. Then she laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she was annoyed. I don't owe you my location. You owe your children an explanation. They're too young to understand. They understand that you left. Her breathing grew heavier. You always think you're better than me. I never said that. You don't have to. I've spent my whole life listening to your judgment. I closed my eyes for a second. This isn't about me. It is. No. It's about Sophie and Mason. She cut me off. If you won't sign the papers, I'll find someone who will. The line went dead. I stood there holding my phone. Ethan didn't ask what happened. He could tell from my face. She still wouldn't tell you where she is? I shook my head. She only cared about paperwork. He nodded slowly, almost like he'd expected exactly that. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I forwarded screenshots from the tablet to Diane, along with copies of the notes I'd found. She thanked me and said someone from the investigation would review everything. For the first time since this started, I felt like there was proof that didn't depend on anyone believing my word. I thought maybe things would finally settle down. They didn't. That evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my cousin, Melissa. Natalie. Her voice sounded awkward. I just got off the phone with Vanessa. I leaned against the kitchen counter. What did she say? Melissa hesitated. She said you refused to give her children back. I felt my stomach drop. She also said, another pause, that you were trying to keep them for yourself? Before I could answer, Melissa quietly added, some of the family actually believes her. Melissa wasn't exaggerating. Over the next 2 days, my phone barely stopped ringing. Some relatives called to ask what had happened. Others skipped the questions completely. One aunt said, Natalie, I know your sister. She would never abandon her children. I answered as calmly as I could. I'm not asking anyone to choose sides. I'm asking you to look at the facts. Not everyone wanted to hear facts. A few family members insisted Vanessa was exhausted and overwhelmed. Being a single mom is hard. I know, I replied. But leaving 2 children on someone's porch before sunrise isn't a solution. Some conversations ended politely. Others ended with people hanging up on me. It hurt more than I expected. Not because they doubted me, because none of them asked how Sophie and Mason were doing. A few days later, Diane called. The court wants both of you to attend a mediation session. Will the children be there? No. Good. I wasn't ready for them to hear adults arguing about their lives. The meeting took place in a small conference room inside the Family Services building. A mediator sat between us. Vanessa walked in wearing expensive clothes, flawless makeup, and sunglasses she removed dramatically before sitting down. For a second, she smiled at me. It didn't reach her eyes. Natalie. Vanessa. The mediator asked each of us to explain what had happened. Vanessa went first. She spoke softly. She talked about stress, about feeling isolated, about trying to rebuild her career. I made one mistake, she said. I asked my sister for temporary help. Then she looked at me. And instead of supporting me, she involved social services. I waited until she finished. The mediator turned toward me. Natalie? I took a slow breath. I didn't call because I wanted custody. I called because 2 children were left at my house before dawn with no way to contact their mother. I slid copies of the handwritten note across the table, then copies of the calendar entries from the tablet. Finally, screenshots Ethan had saved months earlier. I'd like these added to the record. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Those don't tell the whole story. Then tell it, I said quietly. Where were you? She didn't answer. The mediator repeated the question. Vanessa looked away. I needed time. For how long? I didn't know. That silence said more than any argument could have. The meeting ended without an agreement. As we walked out, Vanessa passed close enough to whisper, You've always wanted everyone to think you're the responsible one. I kept walking. For the first time since this started, I realized arguing with her accomplished nothing. The evidence mattered more than winning an argument. Later that afternoon, Diane called again. We've finished reviewing some of the financial records tied to Vanessa's fundraising accounts. What did you find? There were multiple online donation campaigns. I knew about one. There were more. She couldn't give me every detail because the investigation was still active, but she explained enough for me to understand. Several fundraising campaigns claimed the money would cover rent, groceries, medical expenses, and childcare. Yet many of the payments investigators traced appeared to go somewhere else: travel expenses, hotel reservations, beauty treatments, equipment purchases. I leaned back in my chair. So the donations weren't necessarily being spent on the kids? That's one of the questions we're investigating. I thought about Sophie carefully saving crackers for Mason, about asking permission just to drink water. None of it fit the image Vanessa had been selling online. Word slowly spread through the family that investigators had found financial records. Nobody admitted changing their opinion. But the phone calls started sounding different. Instead of accusing me, relatives began asking questions. Did she really leave them with that note? Is it true the investigators copied everything from the suitcases? Even Melissa called back. I don't know what to believe anymore. You don't have to believe me, I told her. Just let the investigation finish. That evening, Diane sent me another update. Her message was short. We've recovered additional digital evidence from Vanessa's accounts. I called her immediately. What kind of evidence? There was a brief pause. Videos. What videos? They don't appear to have been posted publicly. She stopped there. I think you should prepare yourself before you see what's in them. Diane didn't let me watch the videos alone. She asked me to come to the Family Services office the following morning. They're part of an active investigation, she explained. I just want you to understand why things are changing. I nodded, even though my stomach had been in knots since her phone call. The room was quiet except for the sound of a laptop starting up. Diane clicked on the first video. It wasn't polished. It looked like raw footage that had never been edited. Vanessa was setting up a camera in her apartment. Sophie stood beside her, looking confused. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. No, sweetheart, Vanessa said. Try that again. Sophie looked at her. I don't know how. You need to look sad. There was a pause. Remember when we talked about not having enough money? Think about that. Sophie lowered her head. A few seconds later, tears rolled down her face. Perfect, Vanessa said. Don't wipe your eyes yet. I couldn't watch anymore. I looked away. Diane paused the video. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I covered my face for a second. How many videos are there? Several. We didn't watch the rest. I didn't need to. One was enough. On the drive home, I kept hearing Vanessa's voice telling her own daughter when to cry. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Sophie and Mason were chasing Bubbles across the backyard with Ethan. They were laughing. Real laughing. I stood there for a moment before joining them. They deserved one normal afternoon. A few days later, Diane called again. This investigation has expanded. What do you mean? It isn't limited to child welfare anymore. She explained that financial investigators had been reviewing records connected to Vanessa's fundraising campaigns. While doing that, they found something unexpected. Government assistance paperwork listed my home address. I frowned. My address? Yes. I never filed anything. We know. She continued carefully. There are also documents that appear to contain your signature. I felt my heart skip. I never signed anything for Vanessa. That's why we're treating it very seriously. Later that afternoon, I met with one of the investigators handling the financial side of the case. He spread several copies across the table. This is the application. I immediately recognized my address, my phone number, even my full legal name. Then I saw the signature. At first glance, it looked like mine. The longer I stared at it, the more obvious the differences became. The letters were stiff. The spacing was wrong. Someone had copied it. That's not my signature, I said. We didn't think so. He slid another page toward me. This application helped obtain benefits connected to the children. I leaned back in my chair. So she used my information without asking. That's what the evidence currently suggests. Everything kept getting bigger. I'd thought I was dealing with an abandoned family situation. Now investigators were talking about identity theft, forged documents, and financial fraud. None of those words had crossed my mind when I found 2 little kids on my porch. Before I left, the investigator thanked me for cooperating. "So many of your concerns have been supported by independent evidence," he said. "That makes our job much easier." It was the first time anyone involved in the case said something like that out loud. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. When I got home, Sophie ran over carrying a drawing she'd made. It was a picture of the 3 of us standing in front of my house. She'd written "Our Home" across the top in uneven letters. I smiled. "It's beautiful." She beamed. "Can I put it on the refrigerator?" "You don't even have to ask." She laughed and grabbed a magnet. Moments like that reminded me why I kept going. Just before dinner, Diane called once more. "I wanted to give you a heads up before you hear it from someone else." "What happened?" "Vanessa's attorney has formally requested supervised visitation." I closed my eyes for a moment. "After everything that's been uncovered?" "Yes." Diane's voice stayed calm. "She still wants the court to arrange visits with the children." I looked toward the refrigerator where Sophie's drawing was hanging. For a long moment, I didn't know what worried me more. That Vanessa wanted to see the kids, or that the court would now have to decide whether she should. The first supervised visit took place inside a family visitation center. The room was simple: a few toys, a small table. 2 staff members sat nearby, quietly taking notes while pretending not to watch every interaction. I wasn't allowed inside during the visit. I waited in another room with Diane. Sophie squeezed my hand before walking through the door. "I'll be back," she whispered. "I know you will." She smiled, then followed the caseworker. The visit lasted less than an hour. When it ended, Sophie looked quieter than she'd been all week. Vanessa walked past me without making eye contact. She left the building before anyone said much. A few minutes later, one of the supervisors asked Diane and me to sit down. There were some concerns. My heart sank. "What happened?" The supervisor opened her notes. "Vanessa repeatedly asked Sophie why she hadn't told people she wanted to come home." I frowned. "She also suggested that Aunt Natalie was the reason they couldn't be together." I closed my eyes. The supervisor continued. "When Sophie didn't respond the way Vanessa expected, she tried rephrasing the question several times. So she was coaching her. That's our concern." The second visit went even worse. This time, Mason barely spoke. He spent most of the visit sitting close to a staff member instead of his mother. Near the end, Vanessa leaned toward Sophie and lowered her voice. She probably thought nobody could hear. Unfortunately for her, the room had audio recording equipment approved by the court. Later, the supervisor summarized what had been said. "Your aunt made everybody think I'm a bad mom." Then she'd asked Sophie, "You know that's true, right?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. Finally, she looked down at her shoes. "Aunt Natalie didn't tell me to say anything." That one sentence changed the entire mood of the room. Instead of agreeing with her mother, Sophie defended me without anyone asking her to. The visitation staff documented everything. A few days later, Diane called. "The supervised visits are being suspended." "For how long?" "Until the court reviews the reports and decides whether additional therapy is needed first." I wasn't relieved. I was disappointed. I'd hoped Vanessa would spend that time rebuilding trust with her children. Instead, she'd spent it trying to rewrite the story. Around the same time, Sophie's therapist shared something encouraging. "She's beginning to correct herself less." "What do you mean?" "She used to stop speaking every time she thought she might get someone into trouble. And now? Now she's starting to answer questions without looking for permission first." It sounded like such a small thing, but it wasn't. For Sophie, it was huge. Then another problem surfaced. Ethan called one evening. Have you checked Vanessa's social media today? No. Don't. Of course I checked anyway. She'd announced a charity live stream. The promotional image stopped me cold. It was an old picture of Sophie and Mason smiling at a park. The caption talked about helping struggling families. There was no mention that she no longer had custody of the children. No permission had been requested to use their photos. I immediately forwarded screenshots to Diane and my attorney. Within days, legal notices were sent demanding the images be removed. Something unexpected happened after that. A few companies that had previously sponsored Vanessa quietly backed away. One canceled a campaign. Another removed promotional posts. People were finally asking questions she couldn't answer with another emotional video. The narrative she'd worked so hard to control was beginning to slip away. A week later, I received the notice we'd all been waiting for. The custody hearing had officially been scheduled. Walking into the courthouse felt different from every meeting we'd had before. There would be witnesses, evidence, testimony under oath. This wasn't about opinions anymore. As everyone settled into their seats, the judge reviewed the list of exhibits, the handwritten note, medical records, financial documents, the tablet, videos, phone messages. Then the judge looked toward both attorneys. I want to be clear. The courtroom fell completely silent. Electronic evidence will play a significant role in this court's final determination. For the first time since I found Sophie and Mason sitting on my front porch, I felt like the truth finally had a chance to speak for itself. The custody hearing lasted much longer than I expected. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was hours of people answering questions, correcting timelines, and explaining details that had taken months to uncover. Ethan testified first. He spoke calmly about the years he spent helping raise Sophie and Mason while he was engaged to Vanessa. He described finding Mason alone in his room while Vanessa was live streaming from another part of the apartment. He talked about arguments they'd had when he begged her to put the kids before her online career. Nothing he said sounded exaggerated. That probably made it even more convincing. The social workers testified next. Diane explained why Sophie and Mason had been placed with me and why that placement had remained stable throughout the investigation. The visitation supervisors described the coaching during Vanessa's supervised visits. Then the doctors explained the untreated injuries. One by one, every piece fit together. Neighbors confirmed seeing the children left alone for long periods. The former babysitter described canceled plans that turned into overnight absences. Financial investigators walked the court through donation records, forged documents, and applications connected to my address. Finally, the electronic evidence was shown. The note, the calendar, the private messages, the planning documents, the unpublished videos. There wasn't one single piece that decided everything. It was the pattern. The pattern was impossible to ignore. When it was my turn to testify, my attorney asked me a simple question. How are the children doing today? That was somehow the hardest question of the entire hearing. I smiled without meaning to. Sophie laughs now. The courtroom became very quiet. She tells jokes that don't make much sense, but she laughs before anyone else does. A few people smiled. Mason sleeps through the night most of the time. I glanced toward the judge. He still likes the hallway light on sometimes, but he doesn't panic anymore. I paused for a second. They don't ask permission before getting a snack. That tiny detail seemed to land harder than I expected. They've started acting like children instead of guests. I wasn't trying to make anyone cry. I was just telling the truth. Vanessa testified after me. She apologized for making mistakes. She said she'd been overwhelmed. She insisted she had always intended to come back. Maybe part of that was true. Maybe she really had convinced herself it was temporary. But the evidence showed months of planning. The judge couldn't ignore that. The final decision came later that afternoon. The courtroom stood as the judge entered. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the recommendations from every professional involved. The judge granted me permanent legal custody of Sophie and Mason. Vanessa wasn't completely cut out of their lives, but any future contact would depend on completing intensive therapy, parenting classes, psychological treatment, and following every court order over a significant period of time. Nothing would happen quickly. Nothing would happen because of promises alone. Outside the courthouse, Ethan quietly hugged me. "You did it." I shook my head. "We did what the kids needed." That felt more honest. Life didn't magically become easy after the hearing. Homework still had to be finished, laundry still piled up. Mason still insisted dinosaurs belonged at the dinner table. Sophie still asked impossible questions right before bedtime. Normal life slowly became normal. Months passed. One afternoon, Diane called to let me know a letter had arrived through Vanessa's therapist. It wasn't sent directly to me. The court approved it before anyone handed it over. I waited until the kids were asleep before opening it. It wasn't defensive. It didn't blame anyone else. For the first time in a long time, Vanessa simply admitted she had hurt people. She apologized to Sophie, to Mason, to me. She wrote that she finally understood the difference between loving your children and actually showing up for them every day. I folded the letter and put it back into the envelope. I didn't know what the future would look like. An apology couldn't erase everything. Trust doesn't come back because someone writes the right words. It comes back one choice at a time, one day at a time. The next Saturday, I watched Sophie race across the backyard while Mason chased after her with that same stuffed dinosaur he'd carried onto my porch months earlier. They were laughing so loudly the neighbors probably heard them. Nobody was asking permission to play. Nobody was waiting for someone to leave. They just looked safe. I still love my sister. I probably always will. But loving someone and trusting them aren't the same thing. Sometimes protecting your family means standing against the person who used to define it.